There was a part in the book that gave me a good chuckle. I really appreciate it. It was your Roadrunner analogy, in that Wile E. Coyote often finds himself skidding off the cliff and that gravity doesn't apply to him until he recognizes that it should. And you point out that a lot of people today imagine that by changing other people's opinions on perspectives, that they change the underlying reality.
That's right.
Where do these people, like, what can we attribute to the rise of postmodernism?
Yeah. I grew up with Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote cartoons, and I used to watch them with my dad, and it never occurred to me that it was, anti-physics, that it was humor being used to good effect in an era, again, this would have been late 70s, early 80s, when pretty much no one misunderstood that this was actually not a possibility, that you didn't need to be aware of gravity for it to apply. So what happened? Like, what changed? A number of things changed. First of all, this was, postmodernism was this just niche academic discipline in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s. I ran into it in college in the late 80s, early 90s, and it seemed absurd. I pushed back against it then. Brett ran into it in college. He pushed back against it then. By the time we were in college, we were actually together, and we were pushing back against it together. And what neither of us foresaw was that it would kind of go underground for a while. And basically those peers of ours who, rather than pushing back against it in the late 80s, early 90s in college, but who instead embraced it, would become a later generation of college professors in fields that didn't yet exist at the time, the so-called grievance studies fields, fill in the blank studies. And they would begin pushing a model of reality that, postmodernism at its base, at its core, has some important observations. The idea that we can change some things about our reality with social influence, and that there are similarities in how some institutions operate, as between, for instance, schools and prisons. This was Foucault's observation, are really important. But at the point that it becomes overgeneralized, it becomes, frankly, a potential weapon. And so add to the fact that probably by the sort of early mid-aughts, there began to be professors who didn't begin to be professors. There became more and more professors in more and more fields with more and more power and more institutions of higher ed, who believed a sort of unfalsifiable version of the universe that has no explanatory power. Add to that parenting styles that were on the uptick, that were protected children entirely from risk, so that a lot of people going to college had never been exposed to real risk. Add to that, beginning in the 90s, children were being prescribed absurd levels of basically psychotropic medicines, often anti-anxiety and anti-depression meds for the girls, and basically speed for the boys. And the fact that school isn't really designed for any human children, but especially not for boys, meant that, boys were like medicated into submission, and girls were medicated out of their anxiety, but into other kinds of anxiety. And then, of course, screens. Screens showed up, and even not focusing on what's on them, but having people interact largely through screens as opposed to in person, with all of the sensory human stuff that happens in person that can't happen through a screen. And you've kind of got a perfect storm. And, the postmodernism got a grip on people because they'd already not been fully embodied. They'd been protected from risk, they've been protected from their own physicality, and they've been living through screens, and they've been drugged into submission. And this is at one level a caricature, and at another level, unfortunately, not. And I say that as Brett and I taught undergraduates for 15 years, and just by chance, we were teaching millennials from beginning to end. We basically taught the generation of millennials, and God, we loved our students. They were fabulous. And they were almost to a person reachable. Many of them walked in reachable, and some of them had been drugged into submission, or had been protected from all risk and pain by their parents, or, you know, had been living behind screens and were kind of scared to come out from behind them. But pretty much everyone was looking for a reality check and a way to find meaning and connection. And I think we all are, right? I think we all are doing that. And so I am both speaking about a moment in time that would seem to point the finger at a generation, but I also feel utterly confident that given the right environment and given the right prospects and inputs, everyone can pull themselves out of even a bad developmental environment that rendered them kind of in the bodies of adults, but with the brains of people who haven't yet experienced anything.
When I asked Brett this question, I think it was the first time he was on the podcast, his answer was, it's a one-way ticket to a dark world. So I'll ask you the same question. What do you think happens to a society that negates or rejects scientific truth?
Yeah, I mean, I don't always agree with Brett, but I definitely, I do very often, and I certainly do in this case. Yeah, I have quipped that, you know, so Enrico Fermi, this 20th century astronomer, observed in talking with a number of other astronomers, or gosh, maybe he's not an astronomer, physicist, can't remember exactly what his role was, but he and other people who were considering how we could get out into space began to wonder, and in fact, his question in thinking about alien life was, where are they? And so this becomes the Fermi paradox. This is what it's called now. If, you know, if life is all that, if there are as many planets out there as we think, and as many of them as we think are capable of supporting life, and life is as likely to evolve as we think, and, you know, on and on and on and on, where's all the intelligent life that we should be seeing? And, you know, there are a lot of possible answers to this, and you know, some of the possible answers are better than others, of course, but one of the answer that I have proposed, half joking, is a society that latches on to postmodernism instead of scientific inquiry is doomed to fail. Like, there's no way that we'll reach out into the stars, that we'll ever travel interstellarly, if we actually think that believing something can change physical reality. Now, believing something can change social reality, and sometimes social reality can change the inclination to act on something, and having acted on something, you can change physical reality. But, you know, gravity is gravity, right? What the creators of the Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner cartoons had in mind, it's just not true. They knew it. Somehow too many of us now have lost the plot. So yeah, it's, what did you say Brett said? A one-way ticket to a dark world? I'd have to agree with that.